On June 23, 1853, two men would set in motion one of the most ambitious urban projects in history, changing the City of Light. A team had to be assembled. In charge, Haussmann and Louis Napoleon, the former a flamboyant, nearly 2-meter-tall megalomaniac who was appointed as prefect of the Seine, and the latter a Bonaparte in public and hobbyist urban planner in private. Beneath them, some of the most brilliant architects, landscape designers, and water managers that history has ever provided. On paper, their strategy was to create new ordered space in the cramped and nasty Parisian streets, so they began by completing what the first Napoleon could not: the Grand Cross of Paris. This meant completing the Rue de Rivoli from east to west, as well as constructing a similar north to south connection. These roads cut through thousands of homes and revealed a sinister personality behind that of the urban planner, one of ruthless drive for perspective and symmetry. Haussmann's boulevards had a reputation for being wide and dramatic. It's true, that was always part of the plan. Narrow, dark streets mean easily constructed barricades. A wide boulevard means that rebellers now require much more material. The Boulevard Richard Lenoir, for example, was purely strategic, built to cut through radical-prone parts of the city by paving over part of the Canal Saint-Martin, a stronghold for rebels at the time. But for Haussmann, highly dense urban areas also meant that prized jewels could not be awarded their proper perspectives, so he designed his networks in order to produce focal points. His boulevards were not merely defined by being wide with little deviation, they were defined by what they directed attention to. Now, it's important to understand that Haussmann was no simple man. He was an obsessive. On the right bank of the Seine, a bridge begins, and the newly constructed Sebastopol road placed by him did not perfectly line up with it. For many, this would have been tolerable. I mean, who cares? Citygoers are usually more interested in reaching their destination than admiring whether the streets line up. But Haussmann was a different ape, so he commanded Daviud to construct an entire building with the sole purpose of making the bridge seem more evenly placed between two roads, rather than off-center from one. For the green spaces of Paris, Haussmann decided on 2 large parks outside the ring, and 2 smaller parks within it, in addition to the green space of city squares and boulevards. Of the new parks, though, 2 deserve the most attention. The first, the Bois de Boulogne. Located outside the periphery, it may not be one of the first things in mind to visit for the average tourist, but it should be. Louis Napoleon had a deep admiration for the architectural work of John Nash and the green space design in London, like Hyde Park. In fact, Haussmann and Louis Napoleon modeled much of their renovations off of London, unique because it meant admitting that France didn't invent everything. The design of the park was led by Alphonse, and like Haussmann, he was also hyper-focused. Accounts go so far that Alphonse tried to specify the type of sand to be used on pathways, so that it wouldn't be too abrasive for the skin of playing children. The park he designed featured an elaborate network of streams, lakes, and cascades, which required an elaborate water supply. So Alphonse commanded the construction of around 66,000 meters of irrigated pipes, with almost 2,000 hydrants and spigots installed every 30 to 40 meters. The result? Completely unconventional. An intricate landscape built for people in the city, but filled with ponds, lakes, and rivulets. It outshone the London parks that preceded it, and inspired the recognizable parks that succeeded it. Located in the 19th borough is an unassuming crescent, built on top of a quarry. Before going further, we need to understand some geology. Dear Morning Brew, I don't want to come off as someone that's been brainwashed by American culture, but I'm writing this to tell you that I love you. I wait for your 5-minute free and daily email newsletter on business, finance, and tech every single morning. There is no other newsletter like you. But I also want you to know that I sponsored you before you even asked me to. Just to Morning Brew, one of the most successful American business newsletters with over 3 million subscribers. It's not just that I adore news that isn't pretentious, or the fact that your daily newsletter makes me come off as though I know a thing or two when I try to prove myself to other human beings in a social competition that's completely irrelevant in the totality of existence, but it's also that I can experience your content in the most frictionless way possible by, for example, clicking the link in the description, the pinned comment, or just searching themorningbrewdaily.com/hoog. Paris is located in the creatively named Paris Basin, the former location of a shallow, warm tropical sea that produced sedimentary rock, gypsums, and limestones. Across the basin, there are multiple limestone deposits, and limestone can vary significantly in terms of porosity and strength. Different areas use different limestones. So, for example, and also because this visual looks cool, some smaller areas in the Paris Basin may rely on a less porous russet red limestone, whereas others will rely on a more porous gray limestone. Although color clearly demarcates some buildings within the basin, the reason why architectural feats in different cities can seem materially indistinguishable is because of their reliance on a specific limestone and layer. Paris does have its own deposits within its ring, which were also used to construct many of its iconic buildings, but much of the limestone that composed Haussmann's new buildings actually came from a city north of Paris. Limestone was an easily accessible building material, which made it more affordable, but this changed over time as the stone became increasingly seen as a status symbol, and many of the limestone quarries in the basin started shutting down. Limestone is also a strong, robust building material that's relatively easy to cut and shape, so it was an obvious option for the buildings that would line Haussmann's boulevards. When it came to the designs, Haussmann was hands-off with interior, but very hands-on with exterior. Buildings were standardized around 6 floors, the ground floor used for shops, the first for offices, the second for nobles, and the rest of the floors going up inversely with class, with the upper floors being intended for servants. There are 3 important features you'll recognize, but not only in Paris: intricate wrought iron balconies and cuboid roofs made of glass and zinc. All 3 the reflection of the Second Empire style that Napoleon III exported across the world. Wrought iron was malleable and able to resist large tensile forces, and it was used in some of the largest architectural feats of the Second Empire, while also being used as park entrances and balconies. The top floor roof of Haussmann's buildings? Mansard, a nearly flat top with steep, sloped sides. Designed that way because the top floor was practically always used as living space, and it's also the reason why you'll usually see an array of windows. For the roof, a zinc alloy, a combination of zinc, copper, titanium, or tin. Before Haussmann, most of Paris's roofs were made of slate, brought from the Loire Valley. But zinc sheets were lighter, cheaper, stronger, recyclable, and easier to install. And zinc also has the benefit of being self-healing, which helps it last decades. And zinc sheeting can also be bent into elaborate shapes, and the slats you see on Parisian roofs are the result of these sheets being stapled together. Anyway, back to the park. Within Paris, separated between the right and left banks, are the local mines that were used to collect limestone and gypsum. Where the left bank had larger limestone quarries, the right bank's mines were mainly used for their gypsum deposits. The park, built on top of a former gypsum quarry, received its name from the lack of vegetation that resulted from the abundance of clay and gypsum in the soil. In order to convert the quarry/dump into a genuinely enjoyable park, Alphand had to make some dramatic decisions. Railroad tracks were laid in to bring in topsoil, a lake was built, the grounds were contoured by thousands of workers, and explosives were used to sculpt the gypsum mounds, as well as construct a rocky island in the park. Decorating the park was a landscape designer Deschamps, the gardener-in-chief, who deserves a special mention. The style he perfected, and which was exported across the world, were floral displays, featuring exotic trees in irregular patterns of plots of different sizes that were curved and surrounded by similar-shaped paths and winding streams. In the quarry-turned park alone, there were over 47 species of plants, trees, and shrubs cultivated. To maintain the steady supply of exotic plants, though, was no easy task. He established nurseries dedicated to growing perennial plants and street trees. He had specific nurseries for deciduous trees, for evergreens and ericaceous plants, and for luxury cultivation. Nearly 100 workers tended to thousands of plants at a single time, producing around 3 million plants per year. Elaborate steam heat systems were designed in order to control temperature and humidity levels year-round, and carts were specifically built in order to transport mature trees, both to the parks and to the boulevards Haussmann had designed. But green spaces require more than just the plants that populate it, and across the city's public green spaces, you'll find Daviud's intricately designed pieces of street furniture. For sitting, he designed 3 types of common benches, which can be found across the entire city. Benches designed as though they were built off the branches themselves, an attempt at blending furniture into the landscape. Double-sided benches for those wandering through Paris that also had practical advertising purposes, and the gondole, which is just a bench. David also designed newspaper kiosks, the Morris column, and public urinals. The legacy of his genius permeated everywhere. But recognizable Parisian street furniture did not end with him. In the 19th century, easily accessible water for pedestrians was also a requirement. Actually, it has always been. And to solve that problem, one of the most iconic features of the Parisian city was born. The Wallace Fountain. Tall enough to be visible, but not enough to be imposing. Dark green to blend in with the nature and other street furniture, and made of cast iron to solve the last 2 requirements, affordability and durability, many of which have lasted until today. But the Wallace fountains, as you can expect from anything French, have to carry meaning beyond just carrying water, and some speculate that the different iteration of figures on the fountains represent different seasons and virtues. But fountains that supply water directly also require a network that can bring it in the first place, and this is one of Haussmann's most important contributions. The French have always been known as particularly proud people, and the 1800s were no exception. Most of Paris's human excrement was deemed too valuable to wash away when it could be used as fertilizer. What made fecal matters more complicated, though, was that of the excrement that did end up washing away, a significant amount of it ended up in the Seine, which meant that Parisians drew a large part of their water supply from one of their most significant sewers. What Haussmann was not opposed to, however, was drastically changing the water supply. Instead of being provided water from the inferior brackish rivers, Haussmann sought much purer springs, but springs aren't always immediately accessible. In order to convince the emperor to approve a massive overhaul of the water supply, Haussmann manipulated the emperor's fragile ape ego by relating it to the Romans. This worked, but Belgrand, an engineer not politician, warned that it would be tricky. They would have to cover a massive distance so that the high-quality spring water wouldn't be tainted by gypsum deposits. This meant that they would have to settle for the River Doubs, a subtributary of the Marne to the east of Paris and the River Vaughan to the southeast. Doubs was chosen at an altitude of 128 meters so that it could deliver water via gravity to the heights in the east of Paris at an altitude of 108 meters. Belgrand also introduced an innovative ovoid shape for the pipes, which concentrated and sped the movement of liquid at low flow. They were also wide enough for a man to move around them in order to clear obstructions and execute repairs. Fortunately, there also came a time where Paris had to face its valuable waste problem. An increasing population meant an increased supply of waste, which became intolerable enough that adequate means of disposal had to be arranged that could work at scale. The combination with having to manage stormwater, which Haussmann eventually conceded to mix with excrement, resulted in Belgrand and Haussmann expanding the sewer network massively. New types of sewers were constructed, on top of the existing network, along with massive new collector sewers that were designed to shift wastewater from the Seine to downstream of the city. They also designed the sewers so that they could be mechanically cleaned. They designed dredge boats which would float down sewer canals in order to clear up buildup. And they also introduced massive iron wooden balls, which would be dropped in the canals, build up pressure, and then hurtled downstream, clearing away any debris. After all of this information, you may think, Haussmann, an authoritative personality with severe OCD, as well as a ruthless control freak that destroyed things in his way. He's probably not too controversial. And luckily, the French have never had a flair for the dramatic or rejecting authority. But surprisingly, you'd be wrong. So when Louis Napoleon lost his power, Haussmann was next on the chopping block, stripped of authority and relegated to the sidelines, his legacy tainted. And plenty of people, during his lifetime or today, can have, or still do, scream into the void about the destruction of what could have been or should have stayed, that didn't because of his actions. But none of those people will have left as much of a visible mark on the City of Light as he or his team did. Before you click off, I want to say that I'm giving this book away, which is probably the most extensive written account of Haussmann's impact on Paris that exists on this planet, with much, much better graphics than I can give justice to in this video. It served its purpose for me, so if you want, just sign up to this newsletter. I'll randomly pick someone and send it to you, and if you win or don't, you can always just unsubscribe. Please don't, but know that it's always an option. Also, thanks to a bunch of academics for providing me a substantial amount of literature on this subject, like Gideon Shapiro for the 492-page thesis on Alphonse garden design, and Dr. Scher for the incredibly comprehensive articles on limestone in Paris.